All right, so today we're going to really do a deep dive into something we see in the headlines all the time,
Yeah,
Iran's ambitions in the Middle East.
right.
Um, so to really unpack this question of what is Iran after, I think we need to start with, what you always say, the historical context.
Oh, absolutely. You can't understand a country's actions today without looking at where they've come from.
Right. Really emphasizes just how much Iran's past shapes their present ambitions.
Hmm.
This is the heart of the Persian Empire,
Yeah.
which at one point held half the world's population.
It's incredible to think about.
I mean, you can imagine how that legacy still resonates today.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a strong sense of historical grandeur both among ordinary Iranians and the elite. This idea that Iran deserves to be a major player on the world stage.
Right.
It's deeply ingrained in their national psyche.
And then in the 20th century, things get even more complicated.
Oh, yeah.
With the discovery of oil and the influence of the British through the Anglo-Iranian oil companies, like
Yeah.
this, kind of economic colonialism
Mhm.
that really bred a lot of resentment and distrust.
And that feeling of being exploited by the West was only intensified by the 1953 coup orchestrated by the U.S. and the U.K.
Right.
They ousted the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh, who had nationalized the oil industry,
Yeah.
and installed a pro-Western leader.
Wow.
This event, even though it happened decades ago, is still a major source of animosity towards the West.
So we're seeing this backdrop of a very proud nation
Yeah.
feeling exploited and manipulated by outside forces.
Right.
And then into that comes the 1979 Iranian Revolution,
Huge turning point.
which completely upends the political order with the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini.
Right.
Iran breaks away from the West
Completely.
and embraces religious rule.
The revolution really changed everything. The storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the hostage crisis. Those images are seared into the minds of many in the West and continue to shape perceptions to this day.
And these tensions have continued, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely.
It seems like every decade there's another flare-up of violence.
Yeah.
The U.S. downing of an Iranian airliner in 1988, the assassination of General Soleimani in 2020, and now these accusations of Iran supplying weapons to Russia for the war in Ukraine.
It's a very complicated relationship.
It really is.
Iran sees itself as constantly under threat, particularly from the U.S. Whether that perception is entirely accurate or not, it's driven them to seek alliances with those who share a similar adversarial relationship with the West, most notably Russia.
Okay, so when we talk about Iran's ambitions, uses this term axis of resistance.
Yeah,
It sounds very dramatic.
it does.
Well, what does it actually mean in practice?
It's essentially a network of partners and proxies that Iran has cultivated throughout the region. Think of it as a way for them to project power and influence without directly confronting their major adversaries.
And this network includes some pretty groups, right?
It does.
Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen.
And it creates a very complex situation. Iran tries to maintain a degree of plausible deniability about the actions of these groups, but they clearly benefit from their activities. It's a way for them to exert influence and pressure without being directly implicated.
It seems like a pretty risky strategy, though, right?
Is.
Supporting groups like this, I mean, couldn't that backfire and isolate Iran even further on the international stage?
It certainly carries risks, but from Iran's perspective, the benefits seem to outweigh the costs. They see these groups as crucial allies in their quest for regional dominance and a bulwark against what they perceive as hostile forces.
And we can't forget about Israel,
Of course not.
the U.S. That whole relationship is just fraught with tension.
Absolutely. The rivalry between Iran and Israel is one of the defining features of the Middle Eastern landscape. They have clashing interests, competing ideologies, and a history of animosity. They often find themselves backing opposing sides in regional conflicts, which only adds fuel to the fire.
And we saw that dynamic play out very clearly in the 2023 Israel-Gaza war.
Right.
Even though Hamas is a Sunni group, Iran very publicly supported their actions against Israel.
Yes.
But they stopped short of direct involvement.
Right.
They could have escalated the situation into a much larger confrontation.
Their actions in that conflict really highlight their strategic calculations.
Wow.
They want to support their allies and project power, but they're also aware of the limits of their capabilities and the risks of provoking a direct clash with more powerful adversaries. It's a delicate balancing act.
So it seems like Iran is playing a long game here.
Yeah.
They're not just thinking about the immediate future.
Right.
They're thinking decades ahead.
I think that's a key insight. Understanding Iran's actions requires us to move beyond short-term headlines and consider their long-term strategic goals. They are patient, persistent, and willing to play the long game to achieve their objectives.
So we've laid out some of the historical context and this idea of the axis of resistance.
Yes.
So let's get a little bit more specific here.
Okay.
What exactly does Iran want in the Middle East?
Right.
What are their ultimate goals?
Well, it seems their ambitions are multifaceted. They want to be recognized as the leading power in the region, a champion of the Muslim world, and a force to be reckoned with on the global stage.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. So where do we even begin?
Let's start with their regional ambitions. Iran seeks to project its influence throughout the Middle East, counter the influence of its rivals, and create a security buffer around its own borders. They want to shape the regional order in a way that favors their interests and ideology.
And we see this desire for regional dominance playing out in various ways, right? Their support for proxy groups, their involvement in regional conflicts, and their efforts to undermine the influence of their rivals like Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. They utilize a combination of soft power, hard power, and strategic alliances to achieve their objectives. They want to be seen as the protector of the oppressed, the champion of the Islamic world, and the leader of a resistance movement against Western hegemony.
But it's not just about regional power, is it?
No, it's not.
The Forbes report mentions this idea of Iran wanting to export the Islamic Revolution.
That's right. And it's a crucial element to understanding their ideology. They see themselves as the vanguard of a global Islamic movement, and they want to inspire and support like-minded groups around the world. This ideological component adds another layer of complexity to their foreign policy.
So they're playing a regional game,
Yes.
but they're also thinking globally.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a vision of a world order where Islamic principles and values play a more prominent role, and they see themselves as a key player in bringing about this new world order. This vision is deeply rooted in their revolutionary history and their interpretation of religious teachings.
Okay, so we've got regional dominance and this global ideological mission, but there's also this element of wanting to be a force on the world stage.
Yeah.
What does that look like in practice?
It means challenging the existing global order, which they see as dominated by Western powers. They want to assert their independence, demonstrate their strength, and be treated as a major player in international affairs.
But they do face some serious challenges in achieving all of this, right?
They do.
The arms embargo,
Right.
limited resources compared to some of their regional rivals, and even in internal factionalism, it's not like they're this unstoppable force.
That's true. They face significant obstacles and have to be strategic in their approach. They have to make do with limited resources, navigate internal divisions, and find creative ways to circumvent the limitations imposed on them by the international calamity.
And this is where I think becomes really interesting.
Yes.
Because it gives us this peek behind the curtain into the power struggles happening within the Iranian government.
Right.
This whole concept of the deep state.
Paints a picture of a complex interplay between the military, the Revolutionary Guard, the presidency, and the religious establishment. These various factions have their own agendas, their own interpretations of ideology, and their own ideas about how to achieve Iran's goals.
So it's not just about Iran as this one unified entity,
Right.
acting with one mind. There are all these competing forces within the system, pushing and pulling in different directions.
Precisely. Understanding Iran's actions requires us to look beyond the facade of unity and consider the internal dynamics, the competing factions, and the personalities driving the decision-making process. It's a much more nuanced picture than what we often see in the headlines.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation so far.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We sure.
but I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this complex topic.
You're right. There's still much more to explore. We need to delve deeper into the specific policies Iran is using to achieve its objectives, the challenges they face, and the potential consequences of their actions.
All right, so stay tuned, everyone. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the intricacies of Iran's ambitions and what they mean for the future of the Middle East.
So before we go too deep into specific policies, I think it's worth looking closer at how Iran is using this network of allies to exert influence. Highlights Hezbollah in the crown jewel of the axis of resistance.
So what makes them so valuable to Iran's strategy? Why do they stand out from these other groups?
Well, for one thing, they're arguably the most capable and well-organized group within that whole network.
Okay.
They've gotten a ton of support and training from Iran over the years, but more than that, they pose this very direct and credible threat to Israel's northern border,
Right.
which is so crucial for Iran's goal of deterring Israeli action.
And Iran is deeply worried about Israel potentially targeting Hezbollah after that 2023 conflict with Hamas.
Oh, wow. Losing Hezbollah would be a major blow to Iran's regional strategy. It wouldn't just weaken their military position. It would be a symbolic defeat as well. It could really embolden their adversaries.
And then you got this long-standing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is this clash between the two major powers in the Islamic world,
Yeah.
Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like this proxy war that's been playing out for decades.
It's a struggle for religious authority, regional influence control over resources. While they haven't gone to war directly, they constantly try to undermine each other, backing opposing sides in conflicts across the region. It's a key dynamic to understand when analyzing Iran's actions.
Yeah, and Yemen's a perfect example of this.
Oh, absolutely.
The Houthis, backed by Iran, have gained control of this huge portion of the country.
Yeah.
And they even pose a threat to that, vital Red Sea shipping route.
By supporting the Houthis, Iran puts pressure on Saudi Arabia and disrupts their ambitions. It allows them to project power far beyond their borders and keeps their adversary tied up in a costly conflict.
What's interesting to me, though, is that it seems like Iran's strategic goals go beyond just those, religious lines.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen them support Shia groups like Hezbollah, but also Sunni groups like Hamas when it suits their broader aims.
That's right. While religion plays a role, it's not the only factor. Iran is pragmatic. They'll form alliances and support groups that can help them achieve their overarching goals, regardless of religious affiliation. It's about power and influence, not just religious ideology.
The Syrian civil war is another great example of this.
Yeah.
Iran backed Bashar al-Assad's regime, aligning with their anti-Saudi stance. It really highlights how much that rivalry with Saudi Arabia shapes their decisions.
Containing Saudi Arabia is a fundamental part of Iran's regional strategy. They see the Saudis as a major obstacle to their ambitions and a close ally of the U.S., their primary adversary. So any opportunity to weaken Saudi influence is likely to be seized upon.
But despite all of this, it makes it clear that Iran's biggest priority is keeping conflict away from their own borders.
Right.
They really learned a harsh lesson from that brutal Iran-Iraq war back in the 1980s.
Absolutely. That war had a devastating impact on Iran, both in terms of human life and economic cost. They're acutely aware of the potential consequences of another major conflict, so they've focused on developing their missile program as a deterrent and a way to project power without risking a full-scale war on their own soil.
It's almost like they're trying to create this shield of allies and weaponry to protect themselves while still being able to strike at their enemies from a distance.
Mm.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
There seems to be a shift happening.
Oh, yeah.
In 2024, Iran carried out direct strikes on targets in Iraq, Syria, even Pakistan.
Wow.
This is a real departure from their usual strategy of working through proxies.
That's a crucial point. It could be a sign that their confidence is growing or that their patience with indirect methods is wearing thin. It might also be a reflection of the growing pressure they face. As the regional deterrence comes under strain, they might feel the need to take more assertive actions.
And it takes this even further.
Yeah.
That this weakening deterrence could actually be pushing them towards nuclear weapons as like the ultimate guarantee of their security.
It's a terrifying prospect. The nuclear issue adds a whole new dimension to the situation. If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, the entire power balance in the region would shift dramatically. It would also significantly raise the stakes in any potential conflict. But we need to remember that this is still a hypothetical situation. There's no concrete evidence that Iran has made a final decision to pursue nuclear weapons.
Right, although U.S. intelligence reports suggesting they are getting very close.
Oh, wow, that's concerning.
It's like this massive gamble.
It is.
With global implications.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you can see how Iran might see it as the ultimate protection against their perceived enemies.
Right.
But on the other hand, it could backfire spectacularly, leading to increased isolation, economic sanctions, even military action.
It's a high-stakes game of chess, and the consequences of each move are enormous. But it's not just about security. We also have to consider Iran's ideological ambitions. They want to be seen as the leader of the Muslim world, the champion of the oppressed. They talk about exporting the Islamic Revolution. How do those aspirations factor into their actions?
That's a great question. It seems like there's this real tension between pragmatism and ideology in their foreign policy.
There is.
Sometimes they're willing to make deals and cooperate with countries that don't necessarily share their worldview.
Right.
But other times they seem driven by this almost messianic belief in their own righteousness.
It's a delicate balancing act, and it's not always clear which impulse will prevail in any given situation. That's what makes analyzing Iranian foreign policy so fascinating and so challenging. There's always this element of unpredictability.
So we've got this complex mix of security concerns, regional ambitions, and ideological aspirations. It's no wonder their actions are often seen as, unpredictable or contradictory.
It makes sense.
But if we really want to understand what they're likely to do next, I think we need to look at the specific policies they're employing to achieve their goals.
Okay.
So where do we even begin with that?
Well, I think it's helpful to divide their policies into three main categories: hard power, soft power, and what we might call sharp power.
Okay.
Hard power is the most obvious. Their military capabilities, their support for proxy groups, their willingness to use force when necessary. But it's not the whole story.
What about soft power then? How does that play into their strategy?
Soft power is about influence through cultural diplomacy, economic ties, building relationships with like-minded groups and countries. Iran has invested heavily in promoting its version of Islamic culture, providing aid to countries in need and building alliances with those who share their anti-Western sentiment. They understand that true power isn't just about military might, it's about winning hearts and minds as well.
And what about the sharp power you mentioned? That sounds kind of interesting.
Sharp power is a newer concept, but it's becoming increasingly relevant in today's world. It's about using information warfare propaganda, covert operations, to undermine adversaries. So, discord, manipulate public opinion. Iran has become quite adept at using these techniques, particularly through their state-sponsored media outlets and online propaganda campaigns. They've also been accused of interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, trying to destabilize their governments and promote pro-Iranian factions.
Wow, so they're playing on multiple levels simultaneously,
They are.
combining hard power, soft power, and this sharp power to achieve their objectives.
It's a pretty sophisticated approach.
It is. And, it's important to remember that these different elements of their strategy, they're all interconnected.
They are.
They reinforce each other and kind of create this synergistic effect.
Right. For example, their hard power capabilities make their soft power efforts more credible, and their sharp power activities can help weaken their adversaries and create opportunities for their hard power to be more effective. It's all part of a carefully calibrated strategy.
Okay, so we've got a better understanding of the tools they're using.
Yeah.
But what about the specific policies they're implementing? Can we dive into some concrete examples?
Absolutely. Let's start with their efforts to develop their ballistic missile program. This is a key element of their hard power strategy, and it's been a major source of tension with the international community. Iran argues that its missile program is purely defensive in nature, but its adversaries see it as a threat to regional stability and a potential delivery system for nuclear weapons.
And there's no doubt that their missile program has advanced significantly in recent years.
Oh, yeah.
They've conducted numerous tests,
Right.
demonstrating their ability to strike targets across the Middle East.
Exactly. And they've also been accused of supplying missiles to their allies and proxies in the region, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. This is a way for them to extend their reach and project power without directly deploying their own troops. It also makes it more difficult for their adversaries to retaliate against them directly, as any attack on Iranian soil would risk a major escalation.
So they're using their missile program as both a deterrent
Yes.
and a way to support their allies.
It's a pretty clever strategy, even if it's one that makes a lot of people nervous.
It really does. So what other specific policies should we be paying attention to? What else are they doing to kind of advance their ambitions?
Well, one area that's becoming increasingly important is their use of energy as a tool of foreign policy. Iran has vast oil and gas reserves, and they're increasingly using these resources to forge strategic partnerships and exert influence. For example, they've signed major energy deals with China and Russia, which are both eager to secure access to reliable sources of energy. They've also been using their energy exports to build relationships with countries in Europe and Asia.
So they're using their energy resources not just as a source of revenue,
Right.
but as a way to cultivate allies and build relationships with key players on the global stage.
Exactly. And this is a strategy that's likely to become even more important in the future as the global demand for energy continues to rise. Iran is positioning itself as a key energy supplier, and they're using this leverage to advance their foreign policy goals.
It's a smart move, especially considering all the sanctions they face.
Yeah,
It gives them another avenue to influence the international community.
it does. And it also highlights the limitations of trying to isolate Iran through economic sanctions. They're finding ways to adapt, to forge new partnerships, and to leverage their resources to their advantage. It's a reminder that dealing with Iran requires a nuanced and sophisticated approach. There are no easy solutions.
Okay, so we've talked about their missile program, their energy diplomacy, and their use of sharp power.
Right.
But what about their efforts to support their allies and proxies in the region? How does that fit into their overall strategy?
Well, as we've discussed, supporting groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis is a crucial part of their regional strategy. It allows them to project power, deter their adversaries, and shape events in their favor without directly committing their own forces. But it's also a risky strategy, as it can lead to instability escalation and accusations of state-sponsored terrorism.
And it seems like they're constantly walking this tightrope,
We are.
trying to provide enough support to keep these groups viable without provoking a major backlash from the international community.
That's right. And it's a balancing act that's becoming increasingly difficult as the regional landscape shifts and their adversaries become more assertive. But it's a strategy they're unlikely to abandon anytime soon, as it's too central to their regional ambitions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about Iran's hard power, their soft power, their sharp power, their missile program, their energy diplomacy, and their support for proxies. It's a pretty impressive and comprehensive strategy, even if it's one that's often controversial and destabilizing.
It is. And it's a strategy that's likely to continue evolving as the regional and global landscape shifts. Understanding these nuances and complexities is crucial if we want to engage with Iran effectively and address the challenges they pose.
You're absolutely right, and I think we've done a great job laying out the groundwork here.
Yeah.
We've explored their history, their motivations, their goals, and their strategies.
Right.
But there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle that we need to address.
Okay.
And that's the internal dynamics within Iran itself.
Right.
How are these various factions and personalities shaping their foreign policy decisions? And what does that tell us about their potential trajectory in the years to come?
That's the key question, isn't it? And it's one we'll delve into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore the power struggles, the ideological debates, and the competing visions that are shaping Iran's foreign policy from within.
All right, everyone, stay tuned. We'll be right back to continue unpacking this fascinating and complex topic. Okay, so we've spent this whole deep dive exploring Iran's ambitions in the Middle East. You know, their history, their regional goals, the really complex strategies they're using to achieve those.
Yeah.
But as we've kind of hinted at throughout this whole thing,
Right.
there's this other whole layer to this story, the internal dynamics within Iran itself.
It's easy to view Iran as this monolithic entity with a single, unwavering purpose. But the reality is much more nuanced. There are competing factions, power struggles, ideological debates, all happening behind the scenes. This internal landscape is just as crucial to understanding Iran's actions as their geopolitical strategies.
So let's try to unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
What are some of the key factions or power centers within Iran that are really shaping their foreign policy?
Well, you've got the military, the Revolutionary Guard, the presidency, and the religious establishment, each with their own interests and influence. They're constantly jockeying for position, trying to steer the country in a direction that aligns with their vision.
It sounds almost like a Game of Thrones.
It really does.
With all these different players vying for power and control.
Yeah.
So how do these factions actually differ in their approach to foreign policy?
Well, let's start with the military. They tend to be more pragmatic, focused on traditional security concerns and maintaining a strong defense posture. They're less interested in ideological crusades and more concerned with protecting Iran's borders and deterring external threats.
So they're the ones who'd be on the front lines if a conflict actually broke out.
Exactly. Now, the Revolutionary Guard is a different beast. They were created after the 1979 revolution to safeguard the Islamic Republic, and they've evolved into this really powerful political and economic force. They tend to be much more ideologically driven, seeing themselves as the guardians of the revolution and proponents of a more assertive foreign policy.
So they're the ones pushing for a more, confrontational approach, expanding Iran's influence, supporting those proxy groups we talked about.
Exactly. They see Iran as having a divine mission to spread the Islamic Revolution, and they're willing to use force and unconventional tactics to achieve that goal. They also have significant economic interests, controlling a vast network of businesses, which gives them even more leverage.
And then where does the presidency fit into all of this?
Yeah.
I mean, they're the elected leaders. Shouldn't they be the ones calling the shots?
In theory, yes. But the reality is more complicated. The president has to navigate this complex web of competing interests and often has to make compromises. The presidency also tends to be more focused on domestic issues like the economy, social welfare, and they're often more pragmatic in their foreign policy approach, seeking to avoid unnecessary conflicts and maintain good relations with the international community.
So it sounds like you've got this tension
Yeah.
between the pragmatists who want stability and engagement with the world
Right.
And then these hardliners who want to project power and spread the revolution.
That's a good way to put it. And then you've got the religious establishment led by the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei. They hold ultimate authority in Iran, and they tend to favor a cautious and strategic approach to foreign policy. They're not afraid to use force when necessary, but they're also mindful of the risks and the need to preserve the Islamic Republic.
So it seems like the supreme leader's role is kind of like this final arbiter,
Right.
trying to balance these competing forces and steer the country on a steady course.
That's a good analogy, but it's not always easy. He has to manage these competing factions, appease powerful interests, and make decisions that will ultimately ensure the survival of the regime. It's a very delicate balancing act.
And this whole internal dynamic makes predicting Iran's actions even more complicated, right?
It does.
Because it seems like it could really depend on which faction has the upper hand at any given moment.
Precisely. It's not enough to simply look at Iran's stated goals and objectives. We need to understand the internal power dynamics, the personalities involved, and the ideological currents that are shaping their decision-making process. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces are constantly shifting. It is, and it highlights the importance of understanding the ideological motivations of those in power.
Yeah.
If key figures genuinely believe that they're fulfilling a prophetic destiny, it can have a profound impact on their strategic calculations.
Yeah.
It adds a whole other dimension to the equation.
We've got these competing factions,
Yeah.
ideological tensions, all kind of swirling around within the Iranian government. It's no wonder that their actions can seem so unpredictable and contradictory at times.
Exactly. And this internal complexity is something we really need to keep in mind as we analyze their behavior and try to anticipate their future moves. It's not a simple equation.
So given all of this, what are some of the potential scenarios that could unfold in the coming years?
Right.
How might Iran's ambitions evolve as these, internal and external pressures continue to mount?
Well, one possibility is that we see a more assertive and confrontational Iran emboldened by their growing military capabilities and their regional influence. They could double down on their support for proxy groups, ramp up their nuclear program, and take a more aggressive stance towards their adversaries.
And that sounds like a recipe for increased tension and potential conflict.
It does.
Especially if they actually do acquire nuclear weapons.
It would certainly raise the stakes and make any miscalculation much more dangerous. The risk of a regional arms race or even a direct confrontation with Israel or the U.S. would increase significantly.
But on the flip side, couldn't that also lead to a more decisive response from the international community?
Right.
More sanctions, more isolation, more pressure to try to contain Iran's ambitions.
It's definitely possible. Increased pressure and isolation could backfire, further radicalizing elements within Iran and making them even more determined to defy the West. It could also push them closer to countries like Russia and China, strengthening those alliances and creating a more multipolar world order.
So we've got these two potential paths.
Yeah.
Towards escalation and confrontation on the one hand.
Right.
And then towards a more divided and unstable global order on the other.
Mm-hmm.
Neither option sounds particularly appealing.
They don't. But there's also a third possibility, a more pragmatic and conciliatory Iran one, where the forces of moderation gain the upper hand and the country decides to prioritize internal development and engagement with the international community.
I mean, that would be a welcome change.
It would.
But is it really realistic?
Right.
Given their history and their ideology?
It's certainly a long shot, but it's not entirely out of the question. There are voices within Iran calling for a more pragmatic approach, focusing on economic growth and improving living standards for ordinary Iranians. They argue that confrontation and isolation are counterproductive and that Iran's interests would be better served by becoming a more responsible and integrated member of the international community.
But wouldn't that require a major shift in their thinking?
Yeah.
A willingness to compromise on some of their core ideological principles?
It would, but sometimes major shifts can happen when the circumstances demand it. If the costs of confrontation become too high and the benefits of cooperation become more apparent, it's possible that even a deeply ideological regime like Iran's could be persuaded to change course.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No.
There's at least a glimmer of hope that they might choose a different path.
There is, but it's going to depend on a lot of factors, both internal and external. The decisions made by key leaders, the actions of their adversaries, and the response of the international community will all play a role in shaping Iran's trajectory in the coming years.
Well, this has been a really fascinating and eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
I feel like we've learned so much about Iran's history, their motivations, their strategies, and all these complex internal dynamics that are really shaping their actions.
And I think we've done a good job highlighting the key takeaways for our listener. Iran's ambitions are multifaceted, driven by a mix of security concerns, regional aspirations, and ideological convictions. Their actions are often unpredictable, shaped by internal power struggles and competing visions for the future.
It's clear that Iran is a major player in the Middle East,
They are.
and their choices are going to have a significant impact on the region and the world. We've explored some potential scenarios ranging from escalation and confrontation to a more, pragmatic and conciliatory approach.
Right, but ultimately the future is uncertain. It will depend on this complex interplay of factors and the decisions made by those in power, both within Iran and in the international community.
So I think the key takeaway for our listeners really is this.
Yeah,
Iran is a country worth watching closely.
absolutely.
Understanding their ambitions, their strategies, their internal dynamics is crucial for anyone who wants to make sense of, this complex and constantly changing landscape of the Middle East.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery.
And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter most.